When we're talking about safety, first and foremost, safety is actually not completely defined in a regulatory way. What we do is we look for the absence of risk. So by determining safety, we actually do risk assessment. Risk assessment is a scientific process that is composed of two very important components. First is called hazard, and that is really the potential for an event or an ingredient to cause harm. And the second is exposure. And often people forget that second part of exposure, but it's critical. And we're talking about anything. If you're talking about the risk of having a car accident and the harm, obviously you're never going to have a risk of being hurt in a car accident if you never get in a car. So it's important that we look at both parts. So the first hazard is really where toxicologists come into play. So there are very standardized methods and requirements for the hazard evaluation of food ingredients, including food additives. So one of the most important first questions that we ask is what happens to that ingredient when we consume it. In fancy terms, we call it toxicokinetics, pharmacokinetics, but it's basically where is it going and what does it do in the body. For all food additives, we need to know not only toxicity in a short term, but critical is what is the effect on lifetime. So in order to really get an approval of any food ingredient, you have to know lifetime effects. It's potential you are going to eat food all your life and potentially be exposed to that ingredient all your life. So lifetime is the time frame that we are interested in. And of course, part of this is also specifically looking at any effects on DNA, genetic mutations, and cancer development. Also required is any effect on reproductive toxicity. So that includes impairment to get pregnant, any effects during pregnancy, any effect on the fetus, any effect on development, not only structural, but also developmentally, learning behaviors, and so on of the offspring. That is also required for food additives because unlike a medication, nobody says when you're going through the grocery checkout, are you pregnant? Is there a possibility you can be pregnant because you shouldn't have that product? No, it is required before it's approved that you know that you have to prove that ingredient is safe throughout both development of pregnancy and pregnancy itself. For low-calorie sweeteners, also now there is a requirement for human clinical studies, specifically for diabetics, because this is a potentially susceptible population. We've heard already in the discussions about how potentially diabetics respond differently than healthy. That is understood. So also effect specifically on blood sugar response and on insulin is also part of the safety evaluation for sugar replacements and high-intensity sweeteners. All of these studies, and this is not a small undertaking. When we are doing the safety evaluation for a food ingredient, you're talking about 8 to 10 years of research. And all of those studies must include dose response evaluation. So we really want to know how does the response change with increasing dose. The goal is to look at all of those studies in totality and determine what is the highest dose that can be fed to animals throughout their lifetime that will have no adverse effect. This is termed the no observed adverse effect level. I know it's not very creative, but that's how toxicologists are. So it is really determining not the toxic level. That is not what the regulatory basis is, or where we're having an adverse effect. We are talking about what is safe with no adverse effects for one's lifetime. To that number, we apply what are called safety factors. And these are usually 100-fold. They can be more depending on the uncertainty or the tests that are required or involved. But basically, it is to account for the differences that we've been talking about in the previous sessions, the differences between individuals, that people vary, there's a great heterogeneity. The other is the potential difference between humans and animals. Now I have to say, as a toxicologist who's worked with many, many rats, some of the comments about rodents today were a little hurtful. And that they are sort of only models and they don't really hypothesis generating. Well, toxicologists don't really see rats and mice that way. They are what we use as safety evaluation. One of the critical points is to evaluate how is that ingredient handled by the body, and is it mimicked? Is it exactly the same as in humans? So the toxicokinetics will be done in the animal studies and in humans to ensure that animal is a good and valid model for the human safety assessments. You think you have trouble recruiting people to eat cookies? Can you imagine if we wanted to try to do our safety testing on humans? It just wouldn't fly. So this is a requirement, and it's well established throughout the world that this is the appropriate method for safety assessment. So what we really have then is the no observed effect level from the most appropriate animal model based on the toxicokinetics and the longest study that we have, which would normally be a lifetime study. And then you divide it by the safety factors to get the acceptable daily intake. So this is what it would look like if you have the no observed effect level. It came out to be 1,000 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day. Your acceptable daily intake would then be set at 10 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day. So here you have basically that sort of safety cushion built in. The actual level that we would expect to see adverse effects are somewhere up on the second or third floor on this graph. So much higher than where we're starting. I think that is often a misunderstanding. People think that the acceptable daily intake is this magic number, a black and white dividing line between safe and unsafe, and it is not. It is the number that we have with great degree of certainty that if you are there or below that number, you have very low risk because you have very low exposure. That leads to the next part, exposure. So this is calculated using food intake surveys, and it is done by every regulatory agency that is going to approve that ingredient. And based on what is going to be the likely amounts put in different food categories, there will be maximum permissible levels set for various food categories. And the objective there is to ensure that there is not going to be anybody in the population who, with their consumption of the food products containing that ingredient, is going to exceed the acceptable daily intake. Did I do that right? Yes. So the intakes must be less than the acceptable daily intake, or else if after the exposure assessment numbers come out, it's higher, there will be an adjustment. Either the maximum permissible levels will be reduced, or some of the food categories are going to be eliminated. And often what is hit here are the children's products, because children tend to eat more of specific foods in relation to body weight. So often it is where people try to start putting these ingredients into food products where the maximum permissible levels have to come into play to ensure that all consumers, even at the highest percentile levels, are below the acceptable daily intake. For high-intensity sweeteners, we are talking about actually very low intake. If you think about these, they are between 200 and 600 times as sweet as sugar. So you try taking your teaspoon of sugar and dividing it into 200 little bits, and you'll see you actually take a very small amount of a sweetener in order to get an equivalent sweetness of sugar. People don't really think of that. They don't, because often what we're exposed to is the tabletop sweetener. You open up the little blue packet and you pour it out, and you're saying, hey, there's quite a bit of powder in there. I can see quite a bit coming out. The thing is, for most of those, well, for all of them, only between 1% and 3% of it is actually the sweetener, the high-intensity sweetener. Most of it is a carrier, a powder, and it varies. Maltodextrin, it can be dextrose or glucose, actually just so that for a consumer, They can see it coming out of the package and they can measure it. Very difficult to measure 1/200th of a teaspoon. So this is not true for commercial applications. What is actually added to the food product is the low-calorie sweetener itself. It is only in the commercial tabletop sweeteners that you have these carriers, and it really is just for ease of consumer use. But I think it contributes to misunderstanding about just how much people actually consume. In terms of how much do we actually eat then, and this is work done by IFIC, recent evaluations. For aspartame, and primarily this is US data, we eat approximately 6%, the estimated daily intake, 6% of the acceptable daily intake. And the acceptable daily intakes that I'm giving here are based on GECFA. They vary from country to country, so I didn't try to list, I just gave the GECFA ones, which are the universal, globally accepted, acceptable daily intakes. For saccharin, the acceptable daily intake is up to 5, and we consume about 12% of that. Of course, in North America, saccharin primarily is used only as a tabletop sweetener and not present in many food products. Sucralose is higher in terms of the acceptable daily intake, found mainly in baking goods and not so much in beverages. So now when you start looking at this graph again in terms of you're looking for the no observed effect level, this is specific for aspartame, and here is the acceptable daily intake. In the US it is 50. The actual highest user is 15 milligrams per kilogram body weight, and here is the average user. And average users are only people who consume low-calorie beverages. This isn't average for the whole population. This is average of users only. So you can see now we're actually very, very low intakes compared even to the acceptable daily intake and to the no observed effect level. So what that means is there's very low risk. In other words, very high level of safety because of this very low level of exposure. So hopefully that was all pretty convincing, but you'll say, yeah, but that's not what everybody says, that's not what I read in the published literature, so, you know, really, what can you say about that? So, and I say that's really difficult. It is very difficult for people who are even professionals to try to get through all of this literature. I did a review of the safety of aspartame in 2007. At that time, there were 700 studies. I'm doing now one on sucralose, and there's about 500. So it's a huge amount of literature that is available on this information, on these ingredients. How do we explain these different opinions? So my point, and what I'm going to kind of focus on now, is you have to look really carefully at the study. And we've heard that a number of times in examples today about how changes in methodology and design, what is the proper controls, all affect the interpretation of the study. So obviously, is an appropriate study design? And I'm going to talk about give you an example of an inappropriate study design. Is it mechanistically logical based on what we know about that compound, about the chemical structure, about how it is handled in the body? Is it biologically plausible for there to be a mechanism of action? And of course, is it reproducible? Now, the other part that I hear very often is, I also want to know who funded it. I have a little, issue with that being a strong criteria, because I think often that criticism comes from industry-based studies. Well, if it's an industry one, they obviously have a bias and so on. And I'll tell you, I think that that's not a fair assumption, because in terms of the industry studies that are submitted for regulatory approval, there's the very clear guidelines on the study design, on the reporting, and so on, which often maybe isn't well understood. So I'm not saying that there isn't some bias there, but I'm saying that there can be bias regardless of who is funding it. So I don't think that in itself can be a good guide mark that, okay, you just look at who funded it and either toss it or keep it. You have to look at the other factors. So this is the study that I want to talk about today, and particularly is one that just came out, very controversial, in Nature last year. Artificial sweeteners induce glucose intolerance by altering the gut microbiota. And I'm primarily going to focus on the first study. It was a mouse study. There were actually 6 studies all reported in this paper. And I'm going to talk about the first one, which looked at 3 different sweeteners: aspartame, saccharin, and sucralose. That was actually the only study that looked at more than one sweetener. All the remaining studies were conducted with saccharin. However, they then said that all of those studies conducted with saccharin were applicable to all artificial sweeteners. And I'm going to show you why I do not agree with that conclusion. Their final conclusion is that non-caloric sweeteners directly contribute to glucose intolerance, metabolic disease, and obesity. And I added in italics. Their hypothesis, or their statement, is that it's through these changes in the gut microbiota. And by the way, this study was financially supported and infrastructure support by the National Center for Personalized Medicine. So let's talk then about the fate of different low-calorie sweeteners. Let's specifically talk about those 3 that are in that paper. So the first one is sucralose. Sucralose is, the structure is the very same as sucrose, except 3 of the hydroxyl groups have been replaced with chloride. And so you have a trichlorodisaccharide. It enters through the mouth, of course, and it completely goes straight through into the feces. So it is not absorbed, it is not metabolized, it is not digested, and it is excreted unchanged in the feces. So it's pretty much just straight through. Aspartame, completely different. Aspartame is a dipeptide with a methyl group, aspartic acid and phenylalanine, and a methyl attachment. It goes into the mouth, and actually by the time when it hits the small intestine, it is completely digested. So there is 0 amount of aspartame that is actually absorbed intact. 0 amount gets to the large intestine. I'm going to go through this a little bit more in the next slide. And the third one is saccharin. Saccharin is a very small molecule. Actually, it is almost completely absorbed into the bloodstream, and only about 5 to 8% goes into the large intestine. Because it is so completely absorbed, the primary route of excretion is urine. So you have 3 very different paths, 3 very different molecules, and 3 very different mechanisms or fates in the body. So again, just to kind of highlight, because aspartame, I think, one of the most vilified food additives. Many people do not understand what actually happens to aspartame in the body. So I want to just say it enters the small intestine. It is cleaved, first of all, by the decarboxylases, which removes the methyl group. That methyl group forms methanol. That occurs whether you're removing methyl groups from pectin, whether you're removing it from any other food ingredient, such as caffeine, that has a methyl group attached. Those carboxylases do that and produce methanol with every meal that you eat. So that is not unique to aspartame. It happens with all fruits and vegetables. Then that dipeptide is cleaved by peptidases, same as you cleave all of your proteins, into the 2 individual amino acids. What is important is what actually enters the blood. Aspartame does not enter the blood. And we have looked at this. It has been looked at in every animal species using very sensitive techniques. Aspartame is completely digested. The only thing entering the blood are methanol and the 2 digestive products. And these are, of course, found at much higher levels in various foods. And I basically just said all of that. The important point in terms of the paper on the gut microbiome is that aspartame never enters the large intestine. Neither does its digestive products completely absorbed prior to entering the large intestine. So in terms of, oh my gosh, it says my time is up. Whew. Okay, saccharin. I just said this. One thing is that the high doses, I want to make a point that the effect of saccharin on the microflora, although published in Nature, was not really news. It actually was reported in the 80s, and there's a long list of studies that were reported at that time, none of which were cited in the Nature paper. There's actually one very recently, even in June of 2014. Sucralose, the most important point here is that many studies, because sucralose does go into the gut, there have been extensive studies looking at whether or not sucralose can be metabolized by the microflora, and the answer is no. Steviol glycosides, just because this is the only sweetener that actually enters the gut and is acted upon by the gut microflora, I've included it. It was not included in this study, but it actually does enter the gut. So just talking about these, my take home is that it's misleading for a number of reasons. I'd be happy to send you the full evaluation here, but I'm just going to take a minute to show you how then, given what I've just told you, how is it possible that they were able to find this evaluation? So the critical study was this one where they're used an oral glucose tolerance test. And here you see these are the control groups that were water, sucrose, and glucose. These are the 3 sweetener groups. What they did in order to, it was 11 weeks of exposure, and again, they're using this commercial formulation, 95% glucose in it. They then, there's the doses, which I'm happy to show you, but extremely high. What they did was pool all these. Instead of 6 groups of 20 animals, we now have 2 groups of 60 animals. That is how they were able to achieve a statistically significant effect. There's no actually significant effect of any one individual sweetener. In terms of, they also did not, in this experiment, do any assessment on the gut microflora. So the only one that used all 3 had no effect on the gut microflora, or no assessment. The critical point here is, what did they not say? So here you see liquid and food intake. They only reported that for 4 out of the 20 mice per group. You absolutely cannot get away with that if you are doing an industry study for submission to the regulatory agencies. And in terms of food and water consumption, you'd think kind of important in a dietary study. They only did it for 72 hours out of the 11 weeks. So pretty much we have no idea really who ate what and how much. But what is shown here is in terms of this was delivered in the water. You see huge differences in consumption. This is the water control, how much mice usually drink. This is the consumption with saccharin, because mice really like saccharin. What they do is, because they're having now so much saccharin containing glucose, no surprise, their food intake drops significantly. 50% reduction in food intake in the animals that fed saccharin. So, given what we just heard in the last talk in terms of how different nutrients, fiber, and so on affect the gut microflora, it's really no surprise that you see a change in the gut microflora when you change rat chow, which has a lot of fiber, or mouse chow by 50%. Also, surprisingly, again, they don't even report the weight, body weight. They only report 10 out of 20 animals. Now, Nature paper, not that hard to measure mouse weight. Why you only do it out of 10 out of 20? So this is just an example of the so many problems in this paper where there's only smidgets of information given, only a tiny bit, and you can't get the whole picture to really understand what's going on. This is in contrast, of course, to the human studies that have been done, and John's going to talk about these, the human studies next. But in terms of the long-term studies that have been done looking at effect of all of these sweeteners in diabetic patients, and consistently over and over, no effect. And again, I don't have time to talk about all of these, but I want to assure you this has been thoroughly evaluated. And none of this, none of the studies or none of the effects that were reported in that Nature paper have shown up in any of these studies. So in conclusion then, The safety of low-calorie sweeteners has been extensively evaluated globally by many different international organizations and do include studies with diabetics because it's recognized that's a target group. We keep hearing studies about sweeteners on a variety of things, and it is critical that you look very carefully because we can see so often that there are these major flaws in terms of study design and so on. And just to say, too, this is not, once it's approved, it's not a done deal. We just had a reevaluation of aspartame by EFSA in 2013. So it is consistently reviewed over and over again. And with that, I'd like to thank you.
I'm going to focus on body weight management because A, it's on the path to diabetes, and there's been so much controversy about whether artificial sweeteners both either hinder or help with body weight management. And quite frankly, there aren't a lot of studies looking at artificial sweeteners and the development of diabetes. We'll talk about a couple, but so I'm going to focus on body weight as sort of a mediator, if you will, and go from there. So first, let's get the disclosures out of the way. There's 12 disclosure slides. Actually, there's only 3. So I have received research funding from the American Beverage Association, and some of the companies that are part of that association are, in fact, sponsors of this meeting. So that's one disclosure. I received grant support from a number of different companies and or consulting and speaker fees, the usual sorts of things. How have I mitigated this? I don't own a golden retriever, but I did have a Labrador once, and he was really helpful. So I've noted any studies that are sponsored by industry, and the data that's being presented has been peer-reviewed. So the role of non-nutritive sweeteners in body weight management is quite controversial. You've been reading the paper over the past few years, and there have been a number of articles that suggest that, in fact, rather than help with body weight management, these things actually make you gain weight. And if they make you gain weight, then they probably make you predisposed to diabetes as well. So the unfortunate thing is there haven't been any large randomized controlled trials looking at this question in either pre-diabetics or diabetics. Most of the data comes from non-diabetics, and I'll talk mostly about that. I will show you some data about associational studies, observational trials, looking at the association between NNS consumption, non-nutritive sweeteners consumption, and the development of diabetes. So there have been a number of trials that are observational, they're longitudinal cohort studies looking at the association between non-nutritive sweetener consumption, largely through beverages, and the development of type 2 diabetes. So this is a recent meta-analysis from last year that Victoria Burley's group in the UK did, looking at the studies that were available that were large and had enough power. And so you can see that there were 2 versions of the Nurses' Health Study in there, the Health Professional Follow-Up Study, and then the Interact Consortium Study was also in that meta-analysis. And what they found was a small but statistically significant association between non-nutritive sweetener consumption and the development of type 2 diabetes. It was significant, and the relative risk was 1.13. So not huge, but it was there. As they sort of took apart those studies and looked at all the different factors that could have been responsible, the question comes up about, well, what could explain this association? And it's not just in the Burley paper, but in each of the other individual trials, the suggestion that reverse causality could have been involved was made. That is that, well, what if people who have diabetes are actually more likely to consume these products? And what if the more you weigh, the more of these products you might consume? So whether it be body weight you're looking at or just diabetes in general, it's possible that people who have those maladies are actually looking for ways to control them, and they may be consuming more of these beverages. It's difficult to control for. So there may also be residual confounding. as with any epidemiologic study, you can only gather so much data, and there's so many variables that you might have to control for. So there are probably confounders in there that you weren't able to control for. A number of these studies didn't control for caloric intake. Some of them didn't control for changes in BMI. Some of them didn't control for dieting and other practices that may have affected the outcomes. So it's really hard to make a causality conclusion. In fact, you can't do it from an observational trial. But you can certainly say, well, this deserves further study in randomized controlled studies. Finally, it may be causal, but you really can't make that conclusion until you do an RCT or something like that to establish the causality. So if we don't have enough studies in diabetes per se, then what else can we learn? Well, we can look at studies in non-diabetics, and we can say what is known about the effects of non-nutritive sweeteners on body weight management, because as we said earlier, body weight is on the causal path to diabetes, at least for type 2 diabetes. Well, there have been a number of studies. These are longitudinal cohort studies represented here in this meta-analysis that was published last year by Miller and Perez. And the top panel is for associations with BMI. The bottom panel is for associations with body weight. And if you look at the top, among those studies, there was a significant correlation between BMI increase and consumption of non-nutritive sweeteners. And the upper quintile in those studies is about 1 soda per day. And that's important because when we talk about some of the other RCTs, that's the level that's being tested, that or above. So, but if you look at body weight in the same group of studies, there wasn't a significant correlation. And it was close, but it wasn't significant. So in one case, we have an effect on BMI, but no effect on body weight. Nonetheless, there's an association there that deserves some consideration. So what's going on here? Well, it's pretty much the same two factors that I mentioned earlier. It's possible that it's reverse causality, that the people that are struggling with weight management are drinking more of these beverages in hopes that that's going to help them. And it may have nothing to do with why they're overweight in the first place. Or perhaps there's residual confounding going on. In fact, one of the authors of this review from a couple of years ago, Mark Pereira, said that there are a number of, if you look at sort of those studies and you sort them into high-quality studies where they've adjusted for as many things as you can think of versus the ones that aren't, after the adjustments in those high-quality studies, in his terms, there was no significant association with body weight. So what about randomized controlled trials, the so-called gold standard? There have been a number of randomized controlled trials over the years, starting back in the 80s. The longest and the most extensive of the bunch was actually the first one listed here. George Blackburn did a study published now about 18 years ago or so. And that was a study that was almost 3 years in length, looking at replacing regular sugar with artificial sweeteners in both food and beverage. And they looked at weight loss and weight maintenance. And they found a significantly improved weight loss among the folks getting the non-nutritive sweetener. And they also found better weight maintenance, so that at the end of the 3-year period, actually 170 or 180 weeks, they had the people that were getting the sweetener, the artificial sweetener, were doing better in terms of maintaining the weight loss than the people who were not. But there are a whole bunch of other studies of different sizes. Not all of them employed a weight loss program to go along with it. Some of them were just substituting non-nutritive beverages for regular beverages or something of that nature. And basically, at the end of the day, if you add these all up, there is a significant effect on body weight. And basically, it shows that, with the exception of that one trial that Kanders did back in the 1980s, in which men gained some weight and the women lost weight, all the other studies showed either no effect or a benefit for body weight, meaning they lost some weight. And as I mentioned, not all these trials employed a weight loss regimen to go along with the swapping of one food for the other. So I want to point out one more recent study that is on that list. It was the study done by Tate at the University of North Carolina. It was a 6-month-long trial where they randomized people to receive either an attention control, which is just information and do better advice. And these were people that were all drinking regular sweetened beverages. Another group was randomized to receive water, and the last group was randomized to receive non-nutritively sweetened beverages. And over the course of 6 months, the group that was assigned to the diet beverages actually lost more weight compared to control. And water and the other group were not significantly different. So again, there wasn't a weight loss program involved. It was merely swapping regular beverages for diet beverages or water. And in this case, just that simple substitution over the course of 6 months led to a modest loss in body weight. So with that as the background, we designed a trial that was to look at the question of what happens if you compare water and non-nutritively sweetened beverages over a longer period of time, in this case a one-year randomized intervention study. And so we designed it as an equivalence trial, which means that our hypothesis was that non-nutritively sweetened beverages and water would be equivalent treatments when inserted into a weight loss program. So there should be no difference between the two groups if they're equivalent. And we set bounds of equivalence that I'll talk about in a minute, so that if they're not within the bounds of equivalence, then they're not equivalent. And it could be in either direction. So the study's design, it was a one-year randomized open-label clinical trial. It was a multi-site trial. We had both the University of Colorado, Denver, where I'm located, and Gary Foster's group at Temple University in Philadelphia. There were two aspects to the trial, a 12-week weight loss phase and a 40-week follow-up maintenance phase. During the 12-week weight loss phase, as I'll mention, they got specific instruction on diet and physical activity, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. 303 total subjects were recruited across the two sites, roughly 150 at each site. Obese men and women, BMI between 27 and 40, ages between 21 and 65. And they reported consuming beverages at least 3 times a week, non-nutritively sweetened beverages 3 times a week. This is important. So we picked people who were already used to drinking these beverages, not because we wanted to bias the study one way or the other, but we wanted to make sure that they drink them, because a lot of people don't like the taste of non-nutritive beverages. Some of them have metallic aftertaste and whatnot. So we wanted people who were used to them and who would accept drinking them over the course of a year. And we randomly assigned them to either water or non-nutritively sweetened beverage treatment. The hypothesis, as I mentioned, was that there should be no difference between water and non-nutritive beverages. Neither of them have calories, so kind of a simple hypothesis. But we did set equivalence boundaries so that over the first 12 weeks, if the weight loss was between plus or minus 1.7 kilos between the two groups, that would be within the bounds of equivalence, and they'd be declared non-equivalent. At 1 year, the bounds of equivalence were 2.2 kilograms, roughly 5 pounds or so. So anything outside of that bounds of equivalence, then they'd be different, and they could be different in either direction. So the intervention itself was a program which we cleverly call the Colorado Way. Notice the spelling. We're sort of like toxicologists. We're not very creative either. So it consists of 60-minute group meetings each week for the first 12 weeks. And the folks are instructed, it's largely a fat gram counting program, so it's basically a low-fat, healthy diet. We specifically instruct them to avoid caloric beverages, whether you're in the water group or the other group. That's part of the plan. You shouldn't be getting all your calories from beverages. After the first 12 weeks, they go into a maintenance program where they meet once a month, and they get follow-up instruction that's really just reinforcing the behaviors and the principles they learned in the first 12 weeks. These sessions are led by either a dietitian or a psychologist. And physical activity, well, they get individual calorie goals, which is their RMR rounded up to the nearest 100 calories. So if their RMR is 1,250 calories, they get a 1,300 calorie target, which means if they move at all, they're going to be in negative energy balance. And most of them were instructed to move, so everybody lost weight. So the physical activity target was to build up over the course of the first 12 weeks to 60 minutes a day of physical activity. Why that much? Because we know that that's the amount that's required to maintain a weight loss. And so that was simply done. We used the body media armband accelerometers as the mechanism to account for physical activity. And the randomized groups met separately, so the water people all met together and the NNS group people all met together, so we weren't mixing the different treatments, but they all got the exact same instruction. So the treatment groups were to drink either 24 ounces of water a day or 24 ounces of non-nutritive sweetened beverages a day. You could drink more water on top of that if you wanted, but that was the dosage. And recall earlier in the observational studies, the upper quintile was about 1 soda a day. We're asking people to drink now two sodas a day over the course of a year. They were randomly assigned to either of those treatments, and the way they received the beverages was they got coupons from the manufacturers so that they could, for free, get these beverages at their local store. And the people in the water group got bottled water, and the other people could choose from a variety of different diet beverages. So if we look at the people recruited, This is hard to read from the back of the room, but basically the age range, the age average was about 48 years of age. We had mostly women, as you find in most weight loss studies, about 80% women. We had a variety of races and ethnicities represented. The baseline body weights were in the 93 kilogram range, and they were normotensive subjects, at least at the beginning of the trial. The first 12-week aspect of the study, which was the weight loss phase, we had pre-specified in the protocol that we were going to publish that data, and we did last year in the Obesity Journal. I'll show you those results here in a minute, but I will also present the one-year trial data, which is the ensuing 40 weeks. So if we look at the absolute weight loss from baseline to 12 weeks, we see on the left-hand panel the intent to treat analysis, which is we used baseline observation carried forward. There was a difference. They were not equivalent, let's put it that way. So the difference was outside the 1.7 kilogram bounds of equivalence, so we went ahead and did some comparison testing, and we found that indeed the NNS group lost more weight than the water group. It was about 4 pounds, a couple of kilos. The same was true if you look at just completers. Those are all the people that completed the first 12 weeks, which was 279 out of the 303. And indeed, the difference was very similar. It was about 2 kilograms, about 4 pounds difference between the two groups by the end of the 12 weeks. If we jump to 52 weeks, so this is 40 weeks later, we see basically the same effect, just the difference gets bigger. So on the left-hand side, we have the intent to treat, baseline observation carried forward. 222 people completed the trial, which is shown on the right-hand side, and I don't know why it says value. There actually is a value that goes in there, and it was on the slide when I put it in there. So that's 2.5 on the left-hand side, and over here it's about 8 kilos, a little over 8 kilos, and it's about 3.4 kilos or 3.5 kilos on the right-hand side for the water treatment group. I don't know why that happened. Nonetheless, similar observation to the 12 weeks, it's just the difference got larger with time. Now, we were really paranoid about this because we weren't expecting there to be a big difference between the two. We thought they'd be the same, and so we were really careful about the statistics, making sure we hadn't missed something. So we actually did 9 different models for looking at the data, and the one that we used that was pre-specified is the most conservative of the bunch. So that was the one up in the top. The primary analysis was a student's t-test, believe it or not, with all these other different models showing roughly the same effects, which are displayed on the right-hand panel over there. But you can see the dotted lines are the pre-specified zone of equivalence, plus or minus 2.2 kilos. So the two were definitely not equivalent in this trial. In fact, the NNS group seemed to do better for whatever reason. If we look at the time course, this is the data, again, with the intent to treat, modeling it over the entire year. You can see the difference in the two groups, water and NNS. So everybody lost weight up till somewhere in that 18 to 20 week zone, a little bit more in the NNS group, and then they started to gain some back, as you'd expect in any weight management study. If you look at the parts that are blown up from the first graph down below, just looking at the regain part of the curve, that's from the lowest point of weight loss to the end of the study, you can see there was still a large difference, and we modeled that and looked at the statistical significance of the rate of weight regain in the cases of both of those, and they were statistically different at all time points. So for whatever reason, the NNS group both lost more weight and gained less weight back by the end of the one-year trial. So unfortunately, we don't have longer-term data, but nonetheless, they seem to do better over the course of that 52 weeks. So the percent of the participants who lost at least 5% of initial body weight, which is one indication of clinically significant weight loss, you can see a difference here of roughly 18% between the two groups, and that's at 1 year. And we also looked at a number of metabolic indicators. So first off, systolic blood pressure was actually significantly different between the two groups, with the NNS group having a bigger improvement than the water group. If you look at LDL, both groups went down, but they weren't different between the two groups. HDL also went up in both groups by about 6 points in the NNS group and by about 3 points in the water group, but they were not different. Triglycerides, significantly different between the two, with the NNS group having a bigger improvement than the water group. And for glucose, we saw nothing, similar to some of the data Berna had presented earlier. We didn't see any change in fasting blood glucose over the course of the trial, either at 12 weeks or at 1 year. So other measurements, waist circumference. As you might expect, it was proportional to the degree of weight loss. So the NNS group lost more than the other group, but they were not different significantly between the water and the NNS group. Physical activity by the armband measurement was increased in both groups by about 34 minutes per day, but it wasn't different between the groups. And finally, hunger ratings, which we looked at periodically throughout the trial. How hungry do you feel over the past week? On a scale of 1 to 100. There was greater hunger reported by the folks in the water group compared to the NNS group, which didn't see an increase in hunger over the course of the 52 weeks. So the question is, why? And the answer is, I don't know. Because we don't have sufficient other measures in the study to determine the causality of why people in the NNS group lost more weight. Lots of speculations, though. So if we just tick off the possible differences or possible things that could have explained it, attrition wasn't different between the groups. Adherence to the study beverage consumption protocol wasn't different between the groups. We had beverage logs that they filled out every week. Attendance at weekly grouply meetings, no difference. Objectively measured total physical activity, no difference. Caffeine intake, there was a small but non-significant difference between the two groups in caffeine intake, with the NNS group reporting about 208 milligrams per day caffeine consumption versus about 190 in the other group. So the fact that the water folks who were drinking diet beverages who were told to stop now had some reduction in their caffeine intake wouldn't have been surprising, but they were making up for it through other beverages in the diet. So at the end of the day, they weren't drinking any different amount of caffeine, which could explain some weight loss through energy expenditure effects, potentially. Questions and limitations? Well, the hunger observation is interesting. We can't do much with that without further follow-up, but clearly the people in the water group were eating more because they gained more weight at the end of the weight loss part of the study. We don't know exactly why. Maybe they were craving some sweet in their diet and they went and ate something sweet that had calories in it. We don't know. Behavioral challenge to give up NNS beverages, that could have been a factor. Just the fact that people in the water group had to give up something they were drinking regularly before was a challenge, and that may have contributed to it. Yes, almost. And finally, we can't extrapolate it to people that weren't in the study population. So if you're not obese, or if you're not dieting, or if you're somebody who's naive to diet beverages, we can't extend our results to that. So to summarize then, there really aren't any big trials looking at NNS effects on body weight in diabetics or pre-diabetics. Observational trials suggest that there is a slight increased risk with both body weight and BMI. But most of the authors of these papers have said it looks like reverse causality could be an explanation, or perhaps residual confounding. Previous RCTs don't show an effect of NNS to promote weight. If anything, they show an effect to promote weight loss or to at least help manage body weight. Recent RCT data, the ones I just presented, show that they can promote weight loss, these non-nutritive sweeteners, within the context of a structured weight loss program. So if your intention is to lose weight, these things can potentially be a tool. And I think there's more work needed to separate the physiological from these neurobehavioral effects, and specifically the cognitive effects. So if you know you're drinking a diet beverage and you say, well, I'm going to take license and now have a Cinnabon, then you probably didn't do yourself any favors. You saved 140 calories over here and you ate 400 calories over there. So those are the kinds of things that we have to be paying attention to in human beings. With that, thank you.
I will talk on fruit juice and the impact of nutrient obesity in diabetes. I'm heavily biased. This is my list. But for today's presentation, I only received a partial travel grant that doesn't go to me but goes to the university. And I run a little company that is called Brouns Health Food Innovation. Mitigating potential bias. The presentation has been made without any involvement of the industry. Let me be very clear about that. Sole interaction is to create transparency on truthful interpretation of science. Opinions expressed are based on current scientific peer-reviewed papers and meta-analysis. And I have no conflicts of interest for this particular meeting. Dangers of fruit shoots. Why should they be banned? We have seen this all over the world over the last year. A lot of that was related to the toxic truths about sugar, and this was from Lustig, particularly related to fructose is toxic, and fructose kills us. Now, Lustig has made a number of statements also on fruit juices, and the question is, are these complete wrong or are they correct? He said that calorie for calorie, 100% of orange juice is worse for you than sugary sodas. So orange juice is the worst juice the worst drink on earth. Smoothies are not much better, no matter how pretty the packaging, because of when fruit is blended to the insoluble fiber is torn to smithereens. In a whole apple, the sugar is nicely balanced by fiber, giving the liver a chance to fully metabolize what's coming in. But when you down half a pint of apple juice, it brings a huge dose of energy straight to the liver. Now, I have made these points all red because I can put question marks to all these statements, and I'm aware that globally many scientists or many experts say this is incorrect. To put in perspective, and I will not go further into fructose because the next speaker, Luc Tappy, will address that, but misconception, fructose causes insulin resistance. This is from Geoff Livesey, who's also here, and he made a meta-analysis a while ago. And you see fructose intake, insulin sensitivity. You see on the right, on the left side of the slide that it is above the 0 line. There is increased insulin sensitivity at low fructose intakes. Only on the right side, if you go to excessive intakes, and these are really excessive intakes, 200 or more grams, you have a detrimental effect. Now, the same you see with the prevalence of diabetes. If you look to the right side, if you go from 40 to 50, 60 grams of fructose a day, total intake, you see there is a reduced prevalence of diabetes. Now, that puts some question mark around fructose and the effect on diabetes. Recently, EFSA allowed a health claim for fructose. Consuming foods containing fructose leads to a lower blood glucose compared to foods containing glucose or sucrose. And that is what they said. And there is a lot of science to that, and I would like to recommend to look to 3 papers that put this quite well into perspective. One is of Luc Tappy. Look, I decided to show you this because it's a nice paper. Fructose toxicity. Is the science ready for public health actions? We made a big review, misconceptions about fructose-containing sugars and the role in the obesity epidemic, and a paper of John is coming out by the 1st of July, and I'm pretty sure he will refer to that later also in the Mayo Clinic journals. What fruit juice can people with diabetes drink? This is from Diabetes UK, and similarly here, you can see the fruit juice intake as larger glasses of juice can substantially raise blood sugar levels. Now, what are larger glasses of juice? This is not substantiated here. And how does this affect my diabetes? And you see a number of answers. Sugar levels in fruit juice can cause a significant spike in sugar levels, increasing the risk of hypoglycemia. Well, a significant rise. That depends on the dose. Orange juice, the GI is between 66 and 76. This is pretty high, and I'll show you data why I feel this is very high. Fiber is a kind of carbohydrate that, because the body doesn't break it down, is calorie-free. Now, also there I put a red line because it is not calorie-free. Fiber is fermented, and fermentable fibers deliver 2.2 calories per gram of fiber. And soluble fiber can help your cholesterol levels and improve blood glucose cholesterol. Also here a red line because not all fibers do that. Not all soluble fibers do that. It depends on the viscosity of the fibers. Now, if you look to sugar, whether you have beet sugar or cane sugar, and you have 2 different colors, there are people that feel that the white is totally refined and the brown is still full of nutrients, which of course is nonsense. Both have fructose and glucose. Both are absorbed in the intestine and go into the blood as glucose and fructose, but only very little fructose. That does hardly increase, and I'm sure Luc will show you why. There is a lot of metabolism of fructose, and very little, in fact, goes directly into fat. But if you have fruit, apricot, apple, orange juice, melon, dates, strawberry, etc., it's exactly the same. They contain glucose and fructose. And that is going to blood as glucose and fructose, and a part of the fructose is also metabolized there. So whether the sugar comes from a juice or from the fruit, it doesn't matter. The gut cell sees a molecule, it's the same molecule. The gut cell has no eye outside to say, oh, this comes from the fruit and this is from the juice. I'll regulate it differently. Of course, that's nonsense. And if you look to the GIs, I plotted here GIs. Apple, the GI of the fruit is eaten, a mean of 4 studies, 36. The juice is 41, so it is very little difference. Orange juice, 45, plus minus 4, and the juice is 50. Pineapple 51 to 66, 2 studies. One juice study 46, and grapefruit, you see the figure, the juice is only 48. So in fact, the GI is not very high of these juices. And that has led me to criticize the new guidelines of the World Health Organization. This is in the World of Food Ingredients just in May, a far from sweet suggestion I wrote there. And I did that because it was said that in the current WHO guidelines, naturally occurring sugars in fruits are considered to be free sugars and they are bad for you. But according to the same guideline, the sugar in milk, which is also sugar, is not a free sugar. And for me, I really don't understand it. 50 grams of lactose in milk is not a free sugar, but 70 or 80 grams in orange juice is free sugar, and there is no difference in glycemic index or glycemic response eating an orange and drinking the juice. Now let's go to the assumption that it causes overweight and diabetes. A lot of studies have been done. 2 early epidemiological studies. One showed an effect, higher body weight and reduced growth, and the other showed an effect. But then there have been a whole bunch of studies that did not show any effect on increasing weight gain with fruit juice. More recently, a meta-analysis was done by O'Neill and Nicholas, and they looked at 21 studies, 9 cross-sectional and 12 longitudinal. And they found that 6 studies showed a positive relationship. You see them on the left side, weight increase. But these 6 studies were all characterized by poor representation at the population level and also by methodological flaws. 15 studies showed a decrease in body weight or a decrease in body weight, a lower body weight in orange juice drinkers. Several studies, O'Neill and Nicholas, this was a later study, relationship between consumption of 100% fruit juice. There was no association between the juice and the overweight. The consumption of 100% juice may be an important strategy to help children meet the current recommendation of fruit-related nutrient intakes. Now, that is a statement, and of course you get the discussion there, yeah, okay, but the juice is not a fruit. Yeah, that's correct. But if you eat an orange, most of the fiber is in the peel. We don't eat it anyway. It's different with apple. If you have apple juice, it's devoid of any dietary fiber. If you eat the apple, all the beneficial thing is in the peel that you don't get with the juice. So there are also differences between juices. Ferreira and Fulgoni, 2010, National Health and Examination Survey, 14,000 individuals, 100% fruit juice consumers were leaner, more insulin sensitive, had lower odds ratio of obesity and metabolic syndrome. Another study by O'Neill and Nicholas in 2010, aged adolescents 12 to 18 years old, almost 4,000, no increased weight in 100% juice consumers compared to non-consumers. There was not what is often suggested, yeah, but they drink more juice, they has all the fruit juice, so they will drink less milk and the beneficial things. That was not observed in this study. No reduced intake of meat, milk, and grains. The 100% juice consumers had overall lower level intake of fat, saturated fat, and added sugars, and higher intakes of whole fruit as well, which are indices of a healthier lifestyle. In children, Nicholas, 2012, Children aged 2 to 3 drinking most 100% juice were nearly 3 times less likely to be overweight or at risk of overweight. Again, here this may be a sign of a more healthier lifestyle in the family, which is, of course, this is transferred by the parents also to the children. Children aged 2 to 11 years drinking any amount of 100% juice had overall healthier diets. Similarly, less fat, less saturated fat, sodium, etc. Public health, nutrition. Recent publication by Wang. They looked to 100% orange juice consumers, people that only consume non-sweetened 100% orange juice or non-sweetened orange juice with calcium and vitamin D added versus those that had non-orange juice consumption. And they looked to dietary records of 2 days that were taken, not 2 days consecutive, but 2 in individual days. What they found was that the orange juice consumption was associated with healthier body weight composition, lower BMI, waist circumference, and body fat in adults, had no association with BMI, etc., nor with odds ratio for overweight and obesity. There were no significant associations between orange juice consumption and body composition in children and adolescents. Now, what does it, if there is no effect on obesity, is there anything related to diabetes? Now, this paper that came out by Penn a while ago, and they calculated based on available data what happens if you exchange orange juice for milk, for coffee, etc. And you see that here on the right side, where all the arrows are. On the bottom is tea for fruit juice. On the top here is water for fruit juice. The second one is milk for fruit juice. And you see on the bars on the left side a reduction in diabetes risk. And interesting is that if you exchange fruit juice for water in this analysis, you have less benefit than if you exchange fruit juice for milk. Milk also contains 50 grams of lactose. So we don't know what's going on here, but what we do know is that they clustered fruit juices as being apple, orange, grapefruit, and other juices, including sugar-sweetened juice products. So this is not only the pure juice, this is containing all the sugars, also those with added sugars. And that brings me to the composition of juices. Juices are high in nutrients, apart from apple and grape. You see them on the left side, but if you look to the right side, white grape, orange, and pink fruit, they have quite some level of micronutrients that are important. And I plotted them here in figures. And I plotted here red, orange juice contents. And you see magnesium, folate, lutein, antioxidants, etc. There are other components there, like naringin, etc. And at the bottom line, you see Coca-Cola. And people that say, as Lustig says, fruit juices are worse than soft drinks, based on the nutritional composition, you cannot make that statement. What we do know, and this is a nice paper, Aruama in Preventive Medicine, 2012, Functional Benefits of Citrus Fruits in the Management of Diabetes. And he gives a lot of arguments that there are components here, hesperidin and naringin, and the flavones that have positive effects. And if you put that into perspective to health, and you look then to the meta-analysis of Wang recently done on randomized clinical trials, then the conclusion was that this meta-analysis showed that fruit juice may have no overall effect on fasting glucose and insulin concentration. More randomized control trials are warranted to look at glycemic control. And you see here the plots from the study. This is the glucose concentrations. It's almost at the 0 line. This is the insulin, the fasting insulin concentrations. They are a little bit below the 0 line, but the outcome is positive. Another recent paper by Eshak, soft drink, 100% fruit juice and vegetable juice in the risk of diabetes mellitus. 28,000 Japanese men and women, 484 men and 340 women developed diabetes. High soft drink intake was related to diabetes risk in women, but not in men. And the conclusions were that soft drink, but not pure fruit juice consumption, was associated with the risk of type 2 diabetes. Last paper, Xi, in 2014, intake of fruit juice on incidence of type 2 diabetes. The results were from 2 studies. with big cohorts, the 191,000, the other 137,000 participants. A higher intake of sugar-sweetened juices increased the risk of type 2 diabetes, but the intake of 100% fruit juice was not associated with an increased risk. And I think this is a nice indication that fruit juice will fit. And I would like to wrap this up with you. And I know women are multitaskers, so they can do two things at the same time. You can listen and you can read. I want you to read the next what is coming.
The faster you'll get better, the better you'll feel. And ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly the way it's been. Diabetes. Forget your troubles. Come on, get happy. Diabetes. I've done things I shouldn't do. Diabetes. Do the best you can with what you got. Diabetes. And I would encourage all of you. Diabetes. Forget your troubles. Come on, get happy. Diabetes. I've done things I shouldn't do. Diabetes. Do the best you can with what you got. Diabetes. Loosen up. All of you. Now, I'm not perfect, and I've slipped up. There's a line in the song, but I want to tell you, through the years, the closer I've paid attention to the instructions of my doctor, when I don't eat apple pie, and I don't eat ice cream, and I eat the foods that I'm supposed to eat, and I do my exercises, and I take my medicine, and I do the procedures that I was instructed to do, I do feel better. Diabetes is not the worst thing in the world. People do learn to live with it. In closing, I would like to say to you, diabetes. Forget your troubles. Come on, get happy. Diabetes. I've done things I shouldn't do. Diabetes. Do the best you can with what you got. Diabetes. I would encourage all of you. Diabetes. Forget your troubles. Come on, get happy. Diabetes. I've done things I shouldn't do. Diabetes. I've eaten ice cream and apple pie. Diabetes. And I would encourage all of you. Diabetes. Forget your troubles. Come on, get happy.
You get it?
I've done things I shouldn't do.
Food communication is best changed to communication of a healthy lifestyle. We should get away from recommending specific nutrients or blaming specific nutrients or sugars or specific fats. It's about lifestyle. And within a healthy lifestyle, a small glass of juice fits very well in a healthy lifestyle. If you go to large portions, whatever it is it alcohol, if it is milk, if it is juice, if it is soft drink, if it's a plate full of French fries, you get too much sugar and calories. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for this invitation. That's really a pleasure to be in the insulin and glycemic index city. So I'm supposed to tell you a little bit about old stuff, last century stuff, as it has been stated this morning, about the metabolism and health effects of fructose. How can I get? Okay, so I've got some contact with the industry, not as much as I would like, though there is still some room if you're interested. And I have one conflict of interest, is that I'm Swiss. And Swiss people have a special gene, which is the neutral gene. So it's very difficult for us to say that something is black or white. That's the way it is. So I changed a little bit the title and added, or maybe it's both. It's friend and foe, or both, depends. If you look first at the white side, first let's just look at a very oversimplified view of type 2 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes comes from a mixture of a decreased insulin secretion and insulin resistance. And insulin resistance can be present at the level of the muscle, liver, and adipose tissue. Mixture of that causes hypoglycemia. It also causes hypotriglyceridemia. It decreases HDL cholesterol. it does a lot of other things, and that leads to long-term complications. That's mainly micro or macrovascular complications. So what does fructose do in this very broad scheme? So there are some well-known beneficial effects of fructose. And the first one is that compared to sucrose or starch, equivalent amount of fructose will cause less increase in glycemia, less increase in insulin. And in type 2 diabetes mellitus, it has been well shown that it decreases HbA1c. So it improves overall glucose homeostasis. And here you see the results of a meta-analysis coming from the group of Toronto here. Now there are what is usually called adverse effect of fructose. And the first one is that it may cause insulin resistance. Be careful, because when we talk about insulin resistance, you don't really know what we are talking about. More exactly, having a high amount of fructose in your diet will somewhat increase hepatic glucose production, and it will impair the suppression of hepatic glucose production by insulin. So that's what is called decreased hepatic insulin sensitivity. The other thing, which is also quite well known, is that if you have a very high fructose diet or very high sucrose diet, it will or it may increase blood triglyceride concentration. That's what is illustrated here, and that's a dose-dependent effect. The more fructose you have in your diet, the more fasting and postprandial triglyceride increase. Now, that's mainly observed with hypercaloric high fructose diet, and it requires a large amount of fructose in your diet. So you could see that fructose may have some beneficial effect in diabetes, in that it will decrease hyperglycemia, but possibly deleterious effect if it increases blood triglyceride and if it, oh, I have a wrong arrow, if it decreases HDL cholesterol. Now, is it adverse effect? That's certainly an adverse effect if you have a very high increase in blood triglyceride concentration. Now, you have to be careful again. I mean, if you take care of a type 1 diabetic patient and he has very high ketone bodies level, that's certainly something ominous. Now, it doesn't mean that for each people who has a slight increase in ketone bodies, that's going to be something deleterious. I mean, there are physiological variations. And if you look at how fructose metabolism, maybe that can explain these effects. So you certainly know that all of your cells can use glucose. Most, not all, but most of your cells can also use fatty acids. So when you eat carbohydrates, and that's starch or glucose, you will absorb glucose. Glucose can be utilized in your cells right away. For fructose, it's not the same thing, because fructose is not a constant food in our diet. So the nature has evolved that only a few tissues express fructose metabolizing enzymes. And that's mainly the liver, but also the gut and the kidney. And the role of these tissues will be to convert fructose mainly into glucose and lactate, which can be directly used as energy substrate outside the liver, and to some extent into fatty acids. So the role of the way you metabolize fructose compared to glucose is first convert it into glucose and fat, and then export it to be metabolized in other tissues. It comes at some cost, and you see on this slide that when you convert fructose into fatty acids, you will lose about 25% of its energy content as heat. And when you convert fructose into glucose, you will lose about 5%. Now, once you see the metabolism of fructose like that, it's no major surprise that it somewhat increases hepatic glucose production. And I should say that it increases hepatic glucose production, but it does not increase fasting blood glucose. And it's not so much a surprise that it may also increase to some extent blood triglyceride concentrations. Now, you often read that fructose causes insulin resistance. There would be hundreds of papers stating that it's well known that fructose causes insulin resistance. As I showed you, it decreases a little bit hepatic insulin sensitivity without causing hyperglycemia. When you look at whole body insulin resistance or whole body insulin sensitivity at high insulin levels, that is insulin-mediated glucose disposal, you see on this slide that even after 4 weeks on a diet containing 1.5 gram fructose per kilo per day in healthy subjects, you don't see any difference in insulin-mediated glucose disposal. Now, if you look at the few studies which actually measured insulin sensitivity using euglycemic hyperinsulinemic clamps, you certainly can't read this, but there are not so many studies having directly measured insulin sensitivity. Many of them described hepatic insulin resistance, but none of them showed any decrease in insulin-mediated glucose disposal at high levels, at the level of the muscle, except one French study which was specifically focused on subjects with metabolic syndrome and who were offsprings of patients with type 2 diabetes. So there is obviously no reason to believe that there is no demonstration that a high fructose diet per se, independent of changes in body weight, would cause insulin resistance. Now, we've seen the black and white part, and there is, of course, a gray part. And you certainly know that a high sugar diet or high fructose diet has been associated with the development of obesity. I don't know if it's causal or not, but quite often you have obese patients with a high sugar intake. Now, the consequence, metabolic consequence of obesity depend on the nature, the location of excess fat. And you all know that when you have abdominal fat deposition, you will have more risk of cardiovascular diseases, more risk of diabetes than with subcutaneous fat. That has been very nicely demonstrated a few years ago by Sam Klein in St. Louis, in which in the left part of this slide, you see the insulin sensitivity in obese subjects before and after a liposuction, which removed a large portion of subcutaneous fat. And you see that removing subcutaneous fat doesn't change insulin sensitivity. At this time, Sam was thinking that taking off visceral fat would improve insulin sensitivity. On the right part, you see that it's not the case. I mean, that's a group of subjects who had omentectomy, and he measured glucose tolerance before and after, and there was no difference. So this led him to question whether visceral fat per se was responsible for insulin resistance. And he came up with this study in which he compared a group of subjects with similar excess body weight, but with different intrahepatic lipid concentration or different visceral fat concentration. And what he observed is that more than visceral fat volume, intrahepatic lipid concentration is a major determinant of insulin resistance. So that leads to the question, would a high fructose diet cause ectopic lipid deposition in the liver and possibly in other tissues, and may that be in the long term responsible for adverse effects? That's a question which remains open. So what we can say is that if you have a very high fructose diet and associated with a high caloric intake, excess caloric intake, you can indeed increase intrahepatic lipid concentration within a few days. And you see here that with a 30% excess fructose, within a 6-day period, you almost double intrahepatic lipid concentration in healthy subjects. When you double the intrahepatic lipid concentration in healthy subjects, you go from 1 to 2% fat in the liver, though you're still far away from the 5 to 10% that you observed in obese patients. But that's definitely a concern. Now, we asked recently the other way around. I mean, if we take patients or subjects with a high sugar consumption and we decrease their sugar intake, will that change intrahepatic lipid concentration? And that's a small subject which we had thought of including 60 overweight male and female subjects. And believe me or not, in Switzerland, it's difficult to find obese subjects for this kind of study, though we had to stop at 27. And maybe we should continue this study in North America. And in this subject, all had a similar high consumption of sugar-sweetened beverage, and they were randomized after a 4-week running period to either go on with their sweetened beverage consumption or switch to artificially sweetened beverage. And I won't go into the detail of the study, but what we observed was that after 2 weeks, there was no difference in body weight, no difference in visceral adipose tissue, which you see on the right, but there was about 25% decrease in intrahepatic fat content in subjects who were on artificially sweetened beverages. Now, what you see here is the individuals on the left side, the control group, and the right side, the subjects randomized to artificially sweetened beverage. And you see that there is a reduction when you switch from sweetened beverage to artificially sweetened beverage. What you see also is that of these 13 or 14 subjects who all have a high sugar intake, almost half of them don't have any increase in intrahepatic fat content at the beginning. So the sugar intake by itself is certainly not the single factor determining intrahepatic fat content. And I can get to the conclusion, which is that, as all of you know, pure fructose compared to sucrose or starch decrease blood glucose and HbA1c in type 2 diabetic patients. That would certainly be a beneficial effect. That it can increase fasting and postprandial blood triglyceride concentration. That it can increase endogenous glucose production, but that these effects in healthy subjects are small, and it's difficult to know whether it's early deleterious effect or just adaptation to fructose feeding. And I would strongly insist that at the opposite of what you really read quite often, there is no evidence that fructose directly causes insulin resistance at the whole body level, at least not at the muscle level. And finally, there is some concern that fructose may contribute to accumulation of intrahepatic fat concentration, but that's an issue which remains to be further evaluated. And I will end by thanking my collaborators here, the group in my lab. The dog is just for preclinical studies. And also my collaborators in Bern, Chris Bush and Roland Kreis, who measure intrahepatic fat using magnetic resonance spectroscopy, and all my other collaborators. Thank you for your attention.
I do have a lot of conflicts. One, I'm the Director of Nutrition Research for the California Raisin Marketing Board. And the second one is, I get paid by Sun-Maid growers to travel to places like this. And I get research funding from them, and a lot of the things I'm going to show you are not my research, but I funded them through the California Raisin Marketing Board. So how do I control for all this? Well, I'm just going to present to you the studies that were done by famous people, peer-reviewed literature, and people who are somewhat well-known, like Harvey Anderson, it's somewhere here, and Cyril Kendall, and folks like that. So, raisins are required a really hot, dry climate, and for some reason they don't make them in Toronto. And that is because Toronto is one of those places where it's monsoonal. You know, there's Bangladesh, India, and Toronto. And if you doubt that this was as monsoonal as it looks, here's me following. I think this is Alan. Is that you, Alan? That's Alan. And you'll notice the water is puddling on the back of his leg. Thank you for that picture, Alan. I'll send you a copy if you would like it as a memory. Okay. Mine's going to be very short because it's about raisins. We don't have a whole lot of information. And we've got some information on fiber content. I'm going to show you 1-2 studies there, a couple of studies on satiety, and then I'm going to talk about reducing risk for heart disease and prediabetics. And then the reason I'm here is to talk about a study we just finished in type 2 diabetics. And so the first thing is fiber. Raisins are really quite a good source of fiber. A fourth of a cup has 9%. You know, raisins, the poor raisin, it has 9% of everything. It doesn't have 10% like juice or anything else. It's 9%. And so, but it does have fiber. And at 9%, it's got a lot of other things, too, that we don't want to talk about today. And then raisins really are a good source of phytonutrients. And this is an entire book that's on dried fruits. And it has quite a section there about raisins. And so they're really high in phenols and antioxidant activity compared to a lot of other fruits because they're concentrated. And so, you know, and they're huge as far as antioxidants. And the ORAC value, raisins are up there right in the top with all the rest of them. But you know, ORAC has been kind of discredited because it really doesn't mean anything how much ORAC value something has if it doesn't get absorbed and digested. And so we've looked a little bit at that. And so here is just looking at grapes, raisins, red wine, 4, 8, 12, 24 hours after consumption. And these polyphenolic compounds actually get into the system. So they're there. Now, I did this little journal reference. As far as I know, the Journal of Food Science only has one supplement that's designated for a certain food. So I went to them and said, I'd like to do this journal supplement. And they said, OK, so we've got some of these out at the table, at the Sun-Maid table that we have out there. And I asked 5 people to do a special review. So I asked Jim Anderson to do a review on cardiac metabolic effects of raisins. It's in there. And then I asked Harvey Anderson to do one. He's got a study that's in there, too, on satiety. And then I asked Rihai Liu at Cornell to do one on phytonutrients. So that's in there. So you're welcome to pick up one of those. I'm just going to talk about 2 of the studies in here. And this is the one that was done by Harvey Anderson right here at the University of Toronto. And what we did was we gave kids a regular breakfast, a snack, lunch, and then they came to his lab. And we told them one day they ate grapes, And they ate about 150 calories worth, raisins about 200, potato chips 400, and chocolate chips 500. Now, this is not a choice. We didn't say, would you like a cookie or a raisin? Give me the cookie. And so, but when we fed the kids raisins compared to cookies, they were satiated at a much lower level. And so there's some benefits, and you've heard about a lot of these already. And so there's a benefit to eating things like grapes and raisins. And so the only two studies I want to talk about today, and this is going to be very short, this is one we did with Harold Bays, and it was looking at pre-diabetics. And as we learned today, human clinical trials are really not good to predict human clinical trials in diabetes. And so we did this one with pre-diabetics, and this was kind of a fascinating thing. All we did was, and this was done at LMARC, the Louisville Atherosclerosis and Metabolic Center. We had people eat the regular meal, and then we gave them a morning, an afternoon, and an evening snack that was high carbohydrate. And then we did that 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks. We followed them through. And then we switched out the snacks for raisins, morning, afternoon, and evening. So the only difference in these two groups was the snack that they ate. And this is what happened. At 4 weeks, the systolic blood pressure was different. It maintained to 8 weeks. It maintained to 12 weeks. And so we thought that's really kind of phenomenal. And why did this happen? This is what I think. Now, I don't know this, but here's raisins. This is the potassium in raisins compared to the sodium in raisins. And then this is the potassium in cookies, cheese nips, and chocolate-covered pretzels. And the interesting thing about this, if you ask someone who's diabetic, what's a good snack for me? And you ask them if little cheese nips would be good, they go, they're the best. Because they're fiber, they're starch. You know, we don't eat sugary raisins because they're bad for me. And then the chocolate-covered pretzels, you can see. So I think that the whole explanation for the difference in blood pressure is this right here. But what I didn't really expect was to see this. And this is looking at postprandial blood glucose. And in snacks it went up, raisins it went down. It was different by 16%. And the only difference was swapping out these high carbohydrate snacks for raisins. Now, my reason for being here, well, let me explain. This is why I think this happened too. This is natural raisins dipped golden raisins. This is the amount of fructans that are in there. How much fructooligosaccharides do you think you would find in a grape? There's none. And so in 14 days, when you take a little grape and you put it out in the sun and you bake it down for 14 days, a whole lot of that fructose turns into fructooligosaccharides that are amazing prebiotics, as you all know. And this may be one of the reasons that helps slow down the uptake of glucose, of sugars. Now, this is why I'm here today, and I just have this and one more paper to show you. This was also done by Harold Bays at the Louisville Atherosclerosis Center. And this is the same thing, eating raisins as a substitute for those carbohydrate snacks, but in type 2 diabetics. And we find we end up with about the same thing. This is change in postprandial glucose after 12 weeks. And in the comparator snacks, it went up, and it went down significant change in postprandial glucose. Fasting glucose was even different at the end of 12 weeks, which is quite amazing. And then A1C was different, but it wasn't long enough to have a real difference. It went the right direction. And then systolic blood pressure was significantly different in the two groups. And the last thing I want to show you today was something by Cyril Kendall. And I think he just presented this at Experimental Biology. Is Cyril in here? No? Yes, I am, and I did. You did, OK. He did, and he was, and he is. And so this is his study. So up until this time, we had glycemic index of raisins. There was one study that showed 69, one showed 54, one showed 55, and they were all done in specific populations. So he did it in more of a normal population. And again, it's looking at white bread, raisins, and then raisins as a serving. Again, for glycemic index, it's 50-50, and then a normal serving. And this is what we found, that with the raisins, there's a bit of a spike, but then it drops down quite sharply compared to the white bread that's there. And so it turned out to be much less. And then the same thing you see with the insulin response with the bread compared to the raisins. And so this is a better look at it between white bread, raisins, glycemic index of bread, and raisins turned out to be 49. That's the best news we've had in a really long time. we can actually say something about raisins. 49 makes it a low glycemic index food. That's certainly high end of low glycemic index, but it's still low glycemic index. And then so you compare that to a variety of things, cookies, crackers, grapes, and raisins, they turn out to be lower than a lot of the typical snacks that people would eat. And then this is this is 2013 in Circulation. It says, our data suggests that intakes of whole fruits such as raisins, prunes, apples, pears, grapefruit associated with a lower risk of type 2 diabetes. And so this is my research group. You know, I really do thank God for truth, and this meeting gave me a lot of that. But truth is hard to find, and God created grad students. And so it's the grad students that actually find us. It was nice for me to see that the whole insulin thing, who actually created it? A student assistant. Okay, thank you very much. This is my conclusion.
Well, I'm happy about 3 things this afternoon. I'm happy to be at this conference. I appreciate that. I'm happy I only have 10 minutes. I expect you're real happy I only have 10 minutes. And I'm also really happy that there's an evaluation form. Well, actually, I'm really happy there's an evaluation form and you didn't give me an hour to talk. So recently I gave a talk and they handed out the evaluation forms, and then I got to look at them later, you know, how you get to do as the speaker. And, you know, it has those little checks at the beginning and the numbers and everything, and then they have these comments at the bottom, right? So I was sort of flipping through them, and I saw one, and it said, if I had 1 hour left to live, I'd want to listen to Dr. Weed. My grandma would say, it'd be still my heart. And then I turned it over and it said, because only Dr. Weed can make an hour seem like an eternity. So that's a keeper, by the way. Let's talk a little bit about this. This is a systematic review and meta-analysis that we've just completed. Oh yeah, you know, I was a little confused about this, about the program and everything. I mean, these are some of the commercial interests. I mean, I was at the National Cancer Institute for 25 years, and then I left and I set up a consulting business. So of course, I have all sorts of folks who have very kindly provided funding for me to do research projects and consulting and legal work. These are just some of them. And this project was funded by the Coca-Cola Company. And we've all received funding from them. And I actually think this is a pretty effective way to mitigate potential bias when you're working with industry. We have a contractual agreement that we have full and final control over the design, the results, the analysis, and the interpretation of the research. A contractual agreement. So let's talk about meta-analysis. You probably know a little bit about what that is. Some of you know a lot about it. It is a method for summarizing and combining results across scientific studies. It's an interesting methodology because it didn't exist until about the mid-1980s, and you can appreciate that since that time, it has taken off in terms of its popularity and its importance. I like to put this slide up because I want to keep you folks, and you probably know this, that it alone is not a particularly effective method for example, determining causality. And causality is what I've been writing about for about 30-some years now. It is one of a variety of methods that you use. So I was talking about this with some folks at lunch, that if you were to ask me, what is the methodology that you use to decide whether or not something causes something, the answer isn't meta-analysis. The answer isn't randomized clinical trials. The answer is a whole family of methods that you use in order to effectively evaluate and assess a body of evidence to determine or establish causation. And we're not going to go through all this because we don't really have time, but I just wanted to sort of put this into context. And meta-analysis and pooled analysis, which is very similar, really has three functions, as you probably know. It has the weighted average of the observed effect measure. So you have a group of studies, and you're trying to figure out what is the overall average effect measure or average effect of those studies. It's also an assessment of heterogeneity, which is and there are two types. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And it's also an assessment of publication bias. So meta-analysis does three things, not just one. And that just says the same thing with some more words. So, and I'm going to go through this very quickly, and then we will sit down and you can ask questions. So we did a systematic search of the literature for studies, prospective epidemiology studies on this putative association between, we'll call them artificially sweetened beverages, some people call them low-calorie sweetened beverages, some people call them no-calorie, whatever. This is language that has been used for some time. We're going to combine that data using random effects meta-analysis. We evaluated confounding and identified the confounders in those studies a priori. As you can see here, we calculated summary relative risks and the 95% confidence intervals. And then we assessed dose response using the actual consumption data. That is, we used the serving data and did not transform that serving data into grams consumed per day. And then we assess publication bias, both qualitatively and quantitatively. I mean, this is just sort of how you do meta-analysis. You probably all know this, but that's what we did. And here's what we found. So there are about 7 studies now that are available for this analysis. There's only been one prior meta-analysis a few years ago. This is the Greenwood paper that someone mentioned before. And there are sort of 2 results here. One is, these are the crude models. This is without taking into confounding, and you can see that the rate ratio there is 1.79, statistically significant. When you get to the standardized relative risk estimate for the fully adjusted model across these 7 studies, you get this result of 1.12, statistically significant 1.03 to 1.22, and the I-squared, which is a calculation of the heterogeneity. This is statistical heterogeneity between those and among those studies is 36%, which basically means we can argue that they're not heterogeneous, at least from a statistical perspective. Anyone who knows anything about causality assessment would say that that 1.12 qualifies as a very weak association. This is the dose response analysis from those same 7 prospective studies. Here's that same result up here that you saw before for the fully adjusted models. This is highest versus lowest. I should have been ASB, not SSB. 1.12, that's what you saw before. Now this is interesting and this is important because we're basically not seeing a dose-response relationship. So if you look at the never or rarely category here and compare it to monthly consumption of artificially sweetened beverages or weekly or daily, and these are the 5 or 6 studies, you see here that the relative risk estimate is basically the same, whether it's statistically significant or not, and we do have one sort of high level of heterogeneity over there. But this result here is actually very critical because it basically shows that there's no dose-response relationship between the consumption of artificially sweetened beverages and the risk of type 2 diabetes in these 7 prospective studies. Let's just talk about heterogeneity for just a minute because I wanted to point out something that actually Berna mentioned and I think is an important point here. There are 2 kinds of heterogeneity, and the kind that we've been talking about before, this one where we looked at these numbers over here, this is statistical heterogeneity. This is really a way to measure the extent to which the confidence intervals overlap. That's what it's measuring. There is this other type of heterogeneity. This is design heterogeneity, and that's what Berna was talking about. She was talking about differences in study design, whether that's the differences in the type of artificial sweetener you're talking about, or in the terms of number and types of confounders that are being evaluated in each study. There is no, at the present time, in today's methodology, there's no real objective way to evaluate design heterogeneity. We all know it's there. We just don't have an objective way of assessing it. Now, let me just give you a great example of design heterogeneity. When was the last time you saw animal studies and human studies being combined in a meta-analysis? You'd go, Doug, that's stupid. Why is that not done? It's a design heterogeneity problem. They're too different. If you collapse that idea down to say, well, but aren't there other less obvious differences between studies, more subtle differences between the studies, where do you then decide which studies to combine and which ones you don't? And this is an area of research that really needs to be done because there's very little being done right now. There are two things I can think of. One is whether the exposure was the same or not. That's the artificially sweetened, which sweetener you're using. The other is which confounders were controlled for in the studies. That would be another way to assess design heterogeneity. Publication bias. Now this is actually very interesting too. You've probably all seen these diagrams, these funnel plots of publication bias. And this is the traditional way to look at publication bias for any meta-analysis. This is what you do. You're basically, in your head, are saying, or in this model, you're saying, if these results were randomly allocated by the process that things get published, what would this diagram look like, and is it statistically significant or not? That's the sort of approach that you take to publication bias. There is, however, a very different way to think about publication bias, and that is to say, are there other studies that have the data on, for example, artificially sweetened beverages and type 2 diabetes, but they haven't published that data? Now, whether it's biased or not is another question, because I can't predict what those results would be. But in this particular instance, and this is, and I'll get to the conclusion here and then I'll stop in a minute, there are at least 15 studies out there that have data on artificially sweetened beverages and type 2 diabetes. By the way, they also have data on sugar-sweetened beverages and type 2 diabetes that have never been published. And you also, so we're looking at this sort of universe, this sort of subset of the universe of existing data, the 7 prospective studies that have been published, not really knowing what the other 15 studies would have to say about it. And I'm not going to predict it, but I will say that that is a different type of assessment of publication bias than the traditional view. I'm not suggesting not doing the traditional view. I'm just suggesting that there's another way of looking at it. So what do we conclude here? That, and just to back up here, as I mentioned before, there was one prior meta-analysis in 2014. I think there were 4 studies and now 7. So the relationship as we see it today in this meta-analysis, it's weak associations that lack dose response. Whether the associations will be reduced further from confounding is unclear. If you remember, if you looked at the crude relative risk was somewhere around 1.8. You put in the confounders, you get down to 1.12. That suggests that more confounding might be there. That's residual confounding. And then we have this problem of the 15 studies that exist with unpublished data. And with that, I'll make some acknowledgments. These are my co-authors, additional support from Dr. Altice, and again, my comment about the Coca-Cola Company. Thank you.
We have 10 minutes. I think it's a very hot topic. Let me start with a short story about fructose. In Germany, we had fructose as a sugar allowed for diabetics. And we have just terminated that after 20 years of fight because the consequence, if you say sugar is okay for diabetics because it doesn't need insulin to be transported, this was the argument in the 60s, then everybody who goes to somebody who's diabetic brings him a chocolate or whatever sweetened with fructose. And I can tell you this is not good because fructose does increase blood sugar, even though it does not more than other sugars, but it does increase blood sugar. So I'm quite reserved about the thing with sugar. I think it's correct, as you showed it. It's not more toxic than anything else, and it's associated with diabetes only in the context of obesity. But still, it's not a good sugar for diabetics. Okay, but this was my comment. Now, I would like to ask you for comments from the public or discussion, please. Do we have a microphone?
Hi, Tom Oliver from Toronto. Bernadette, I had a quick question for you. Do you consider the strains of animals when you do the toxicology studies? Because that would be a question for you. And the question for Dr. Peters is what kind of sweetener what was the artificial sweetener in your study?
Yes, in terms of the strain, again, a lot of times it is based on the pharmacokinetics, and which is most relevant in terms of comparative to humans. But so yes, and also just even which species would be used for the final assessment of the NOEL, that would also be determined by the comparative toxicokinetics.
Okay. Other question? Okay.
Sorry, for Dr. Peters, you showed a study with water versus soft drink. So what was the sweetener in that soft drink?
The answer is yes. It was basically every one of the sweeteners that's currently available on the market that's present in beverages was on the table for people to select from. So it included aspartame, ACE-K, sucralose, stevia, etc.
Yes, Saul Katz from Solo GI Nutrition. In developing products for people with diabetes, it's my belief that, and I'm not a scientist, but I've been in the industry for quite a while, it's my belief that it's better to provide carbohydrates in the food product. We develop nutrition bars where the entire product is clinically validated to be very low glycemic, and ours are between 23 and 35, without sugar alcohols or artificial sweeteners, because I think people with diabetes need energy too, and not sugar alcohols to bind fat and protein together and not give them energy to get up and exercise. So I'd be interested in your comments on that.
So who wants to answer?
Well, I suppose I don't really follow the point about not having the artificial sweetener, because obviously you get energy from other things. I mean, the primary role of the replacement of use of artificial sweeteners or high-intensity sweeteners is to reduce the amount of sucrose, the amount of sugar. Is not effective to necessarily reduce complex carbohydrates. So that logic didn't quite follow.
Well, I think other companies prefer to dampen the glycemic response using chemically altered carbohydrates that don't contribute energy and are designed to pass through the body and in the process cause a laxative effect or stomach upset. So I'd rather give people real food that's released more slowly, which releases the sugars more slowly, so they have energy without the upset.
Okay. I think this is a topic of the next session, so we might not discuss it here. And carbohydrate is not an essential nutrient, by the way, for humans and other animals, while fat and protein is. But anyway, I think the gentleman here was the next for the question.
Thank you. I think you've provided some reasonable evidence that non-nutritive sweeteners are associated with various adverse health outcomes, and there's a few theories as to why. But in particular in observational studies, I'm just thinking guilt by association is a potential explanation, and none of you really touched on it, so I'd be interested in your thoughts about that.
Well, the point of my presentation was to show no adverse effects.
Okay. Angela?
Angela Rivellis, Naples, Italy. A question to Luc regarding fructose. You have said that fructose, one of the main negative effects, possible negative effects of fructose is on blood lipids, not on blood glucose and so on, especially when the amount of fructose is relatively high. How much is this amount? And do you believe that it's possible in the real life easily to get this amount, especially for some people, young people and so on?
Okay, first, it's gonna, the amount of fructose at which you will start observing potentially adverse changes in risk factors varies a lot from one individual to another. It depends mainly on physical activity. For somebody who is physically active, and athletes can have very high sugar intake without any adverse metabolic effects. Now, in sedentary people, the first effects are observed with daily intakes above 50 to 60 grams. Pure fructose would be about 100 and 120 grams sugar.
Can I just say something?
Maybe I may add there also a point. Luc specifically says with pure fructose. Now, realize that in daily life, we humans do not consume pure fructose. Pure fructose has other effects. If you have more than 35 grams as a bolus intake, you may react with diarrhea. If you have a little bit of glucose in it to addition, you get no diarrhea. But also the metabolism is different. If you look to animal studies that are done on pure fructose compared to sucrose, you see very detrimental effects of high intakes of pure fructose. But if you have equal amounts of sucrose, which is half less fructose, but the same amount of energy, these negative effects disappear. So at the end, it comes to doses. And we have done, and Wim is also here. One of my first studies was mimicking Tour de France cycling. We had cyclists up to 6,500 kilocalories per day in a respiration chamber. We controlled everything. They were on high sucrose intakes and high fructose intakes, and they had no effect whatsoever on their lipids. That was negative, simply because they burn all the calories. So it depends on physical activity, and it depends on the total amount related to your normal energy turnover.
Thanks.
Good.
Just a quick question.
Well, actually, I wanted to come back to the question that was asked before, because I have been thinking about what you meant by guilt by association. I'm assuming you're talking about whether or not one can discern a hazard based on observational studies, right? And you've actually heard one of the speakers here say you cannot do that. Okay, well, it's an interesting idea. It tends to show up in communities in the nutrition world. It certainly doesn't show up in other lifestyle areas, in pharmaceuticals or in chemicals. Happens all the time. I mean, the classic example is smoking and lung cancer. There wasn't any biology of smoking and lung cancer back when we decided that smoking causes lung cancer solely on the epidemiology. And you could say, well, it was a different epidemic. No, but we're talking about a methodological claim here that you can't do it. Well, of course you can. It doesn't make it easy, it doesn't make it straightforward. And what you have seen in the public health and epidemiology community over time is a change in what is required for a determination of causation in terms of magnitudes of effect, presence or lack of presence of dose response, and the requirement for a biologic mechanism. So you've seen a change in standards over time. Let me give you an example. In 1964, when smoking was looked at in terms of causality, in terms of lung cancer, no claim, it wasn't just lung cancer, they were looking at a variety of cancers, no claim of causation was made without a relative risk of 3 in the studies. In the 1980s, that had come down to 2. And now we're in a very different world in which people are actually claiming that things like that 1.12 is causal. Well, it's not that you can absolutely refute that. It's just that the alternatives become so much more prominent the closer you get to one. The alternative explanations, residual confounding, real confounding, bias, etc. So I don't know if that helps answer your question, but it sort of puts it in the context of what you meant. But anyway, I just wanted to say that.
Thanks. I think there is time for one short question because John gets very nervous back there.
I'll make it really quick. One thing that I think is missing from the research at the moment is what happens when a doctor says, reduce sugar-sweetened soft drink, eat artificial sweetened soft drink if you'd like. All right. What happens when you cut those calories? Maybe it's 1 can or 2 cans a day. Maybe that's 120, 250 calories. What happens to the rest of the diet? What replaces those calories? Is it that choice between the Diet Coke is now accompanied by a packet of chips, and you've increased the saturated fat and the sodium and other things? So why aren't we hearing this research? Why aren't we analysing the rest of the diet?
Well, I know at least one study that has been done on stevia, saccharin, and cyclamate, where they look to food intake compared to sugar-sweetened beverage. And those who had the sweetened beverages had a reduced food intake based on 24-hour measurements over time. I think it was a week or 2 weeks that they measured that. And it is published 2 years ago, I think. It was one of the first studies on stevia, and the concern that stevia, as the new natural sweetener, might increase food intake. But that was not shown. There was a reduced energy intake overall. So seemingly, at least in that study, there was no compensation that people who had such a drink were taking something else.
The literature is kind of a mess on this point. It's basically the context in which the study is being done. I mean, for example, in our study where people were intentionally trying to lose weight, they're cognitively basically trying to not compensate. Then you have other studies where they're just swapping out beverages when people may or may not compensate. I think the answers in the literature are all over the map in terms of what's been seen. And I don't know that there's any really clear sense of it. Adam Janowski published a paper recently looking at diet quality index and found that people who consumed artificially sweetened beverages on a regular basis actually had a higher diet quality index. But it's potentially because they were paying attention to their diet, and this is just one of the factors that they were doing to try to improve their diet, so they're improving other things at the same time. So I think it's a legitimate question. That's why I was saying that it's really important that we get at these cognitive effects and understand what people are doing with these when they have the can and they're looking at the nutrition information and says 0 calories. What does that give me license to do?
Okay, I think we have to come to an end. There are many open. Please go discuss with the speaker directly. I mean, others craving business and so still to address, and there are many aspects. Thanks a lot to the excellent speakers, I think, who were really very endowed.